Secrecy. The objective of this module is to understand the main issues surrounding the governmental practice of secrecy. This module was written by Manohar Kumar from IIT Delhi. I'm Akash Singh Rathod from the Lewis University of Rome. Secrecy is the intentional hiding of information or an act from being revealed to others. In this case, what we're concerned about is not personal secrecy or hiding one's own behavior, but governmental secrecy. In the case of governmental practices of secrecy, the information is sought to be hidden from the glare of not only external enemies or foreign entities, but even that of its own citizens. Democracies are obviously based on the ideal of publicity. And at the outset, it might seem that secrecy conflicts with the norms of publicity. But the very reasons that lie at the foundations of modern democracy can also be understood to justify the need for secrecy too. The main understanding of political philosophy, the function of government is to protect citizens from one another and to protect citizens from external threats. So both internal and external security. Simultaneous demand for government to be responsible and adequately represent the will of the people demands publicity, but the requirement of security may require secrecy. So on the one hand, the logic of democracy at first strikes us as wanting to limit secrecy in favor of publicity. But if we look closely at the origins of democratic thinking, there is some sense in seeing the need for the coexistence of both publicity and secrecy. So what is the democratic need for secrecy? Secrecy is required for the reasons of security, primarily. There is another argument common in political theory that suggests that secrecy is also conducive to the kind of deliberation that is important in democracy. So we have two main arguments for the need for secrecy within democracies. Now, if we were not talking about democracies, this wouldn't be a problem. The political theorist Bobbio had argued that the need for both secrecy and publicity is a fundamental paradox to democracies. But once again, we're speaking only of democracies. If the regime in question were a monarchy, if it were a tyranny of some sort, then this wouldn't be an issue because there are no obligations to keep the public informed of decisions. In terms of the democratic need for secrecy as a need for security, the promise of security allows for democratic institutions to function without any perception of threat. So democracies require institutions in order to fulfill the mandate, but those institutions can't function unless there's a certain level of security that they enjoy. In order to make any particular country safe against both internal and external threats, the executive branch, and remember that secrecy is primarily the preserve of the executive branch, the legislative branch as representing the members of the body politic at large, generally don't conduct anything secretly. The executive branch has to remain alert. This is the idea. In order to protect from internal and external threats, the executive branch has to remain alert. And to remain alert and vigilant requires certain operations to be kept secret. You can see this in the fact that not only does practically every single government on earth have a kind of secret service, a kind of intelligence agency that operates in secret, but every democracy does have a secret service and various forms of intelligence agencies. These agencies all operate under the executive branch. There are certain policies which require secrecy to be not only possible, but also to be effective. You can think very clearly of military operations. How could any military operation be effected properly without secrecy? In addition to the security argument about secrecy being consistent with democracy, there's also a deliberative argument. Now, we all know from democratic thinking that a democracy requires deliberation of people. The specific people chosen to represent the will of the public are generally referred to as legislators, and the debates that occur between these legislators may also play out both in public, consistent with publicity requirements, but at certain times in secret. Now, why would we do that? What would that mean? These are the people who are supposed to represent our interests. So why should people representing our interests keep these debates over our interests secret from us? The argument is basically this, that individuals and policymakers can deliberate in private without the pressure of the public gaze, without the pressure of public interest groups who try to influence the decision of those policymakers, and that lobbyists who might force these policymakers to orient policies in favor of their own interests. So this is a rather intriguing argument trying to suggest that secrecy may not only be something that democracies have to tolerate and put up with because of the legitimate concern about security, but it's almost a pro-democracy argument for secrecy, in the sense that unless legislators are able to deliberate calmly and freely outside of the public gaze, the decisions they reach might not actually be in the best interest of the people at large. The decisions that they reach within full view of the public and all of the pressures that are consequent to that may lead, in fact, to more narrow decisions. So according to this line of argumentation, secrecy promotes democratic deliberation. The veil of secrecy allows individuals to make better sense of others' arguments, to hear out reasons, and allows time for deliberation without the pressure of playing to the gallery. The quality of decisions improve if those deliberating are protected from the glare of publicity. Now, these two arguments, secrecy and about secrecy, which are security and deliberation, together constitute the reasons why we can see secrecy within a democracy not as a paradox, but as in some way complementary. In opposition to the position of Bobbio, whom I had mentioned as suggesting that this is a fundamental paradox of democratic societies, that we should have both the need for publicity in order for our government to be in any way democratic, and the need for security for that democratic government to run efficiently. This position of Bobbio has been taken to task by another political theorist named Dennis Thompson. The force of Thompson's argument is largely that of a pro-democratic understanding of secrecy along the lines of deliberation. Well, whether Thompson is right or not, anybody can see that there are a number of grave problems with secrecy. Secrecy of the executive branch, secrecy of closed deliberations of the legislative branch. While they may promote security and they may promote deliberation, there are also a number of problems associated when a government that is supposed to be democratic engages in practices of secrecy. So let's discuss what these problems are. Secrecy allows for the exclusive control over information for the executive, which gives unrestrained powers. That's precisely the definition of secrecy, exclusive control over information. Do we really want the executive branch to have exclusive control over information? What does that mean if they have exclusive control? Well, one of the obvious fallouts is that the checks and balances system, where each of the branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial, are supposed to keep a check on each other and balance each other out, that this checks and balance system breaks down. No one else has access to the information that the executive branch is keeping close guard on. So how can they balance it and how can they check it? That's internal to the branches of government. What about external? Think about public accountability. We want our executive, be it the Prime Minister, as in India, the NSA, the security advisors, and other executive operations of government, we want them to be accountable. After all, we elected them. How can they be accountable to us if their operations are conducted in secret and if all of the information about those operations are retained in secret? So not only is there an internal governmental issue about checks and balances not being able to function, there's also the external issue that public accountability suffers the more secrecy increases. Well, what does that matter? It matters because secrecy allows the executive actually to manipulate and deceive the public on important public policy matters. So it's not simply that we don't know what they're doing, but when the executive has total control of information, the executive can even deceive us about what they're doing. So this is one step further. On the one hand, I may not know what's happening. On the other hand, something else might be happening from what we are told is happening. How do we manage that deception? Even further, selective leaking on the part of government of documents meant to be secret can easily orient the public at large toward a particular policy that the government may want to pursue, but for which there's not a great deal of public support. This has happened numerous times in recent Indian history, where confidential or secret information is leaked by unknown sources to the press, and the public response gives the leaker the exact momentum required in order to pursue some sort of policy or interest for which he or she had no support beforehand. Obviously, that's not how democracy and democratic decision-making is supposed to work. Secrecy can debilitate judgments by allowing people to uphold judgments and opinions without being challenged by others. How can we know what we feel about a particular policy if we're uninformed about either what the policy is or why the policy was enacted or how effective the policy was? These are key moments of decision-making that we need in order to reach a conclusion on whether we would support or remove support from a particular policy. As long as any aspect of these moments that we require to make a proper judgment are withheld from us, we are subject to the whims of an unaccountable executive. That means that public officials who have privileged information may in fact use that information not only to manipulate us, but to manipulate others into pursuing personal ends. When everything is shrouded in a level of secrecy, the possibility for corruption increases many, many times. Secrecy interrupts this basic operation of democracy by compromising the political sovereignty of citizens. How can you be sovereign if you have no access to the information? When we are denied the basic information that is required to understand the choices that we want implemented, our ability to make rational arguments and make informed decisions is completely compromised. So what is the ground of what is supposed to be public policy? Not the public, but the will of the executive. So this is yet another problem that arises when the executive has exclusive control over information. Secret policies, in other words, can easily be used to harm the interest of citizens just as much as it can be used to enhance the interests of citizens. Now, one of the major justifications for secrecy is, of course, that we need to protect ourselves from non-citizens, outsiders, and outside threats. The irony is that the kind of secrecy that is maintained in order to protect the state or the citizens from outside threats may come back to harm the very citizens who are supposed to be protected by that secrecy through corruption and the removal of accountability and so on. So what is clear from the enumeration of these problems about secrecy is that the knowledge that citizens require to live and practice a vibrant democracy is hampered by information being kept from them. This is why we have Right to Information Acts and other forms of publicity of law and the affairs of state. But the more secrecy there is, the more citizens are hampered in their understanding of the affairs of state. Hidden state of affairs can be a very dangerous thing. We know the arguments for why we need it in terms of security, but think about how dangerous it can be when the affairs of state might be incursions on the basic rights of citizens. Now, we all know that the incursions on the fundamental human rights of non-citizens is a constant threat by our own external intelligence and military forces. But considering that these people are non-citizens and considering that our access to that information is often limited, or it is presented to us in a kind of spin through the media, we often take that less lightly. However, a lot of the basic rights that can be violated by secrecy are the fundamental rights of our own citizens. There are numerous cases of this in terms of secret wiretapping that has been undertaken by various intelligence and military agencies in India. In the United States, this has taken on a huge proportion when it was discovered that the National Security Agency, the NSA, was conducting surveillance operations across the board on all United States citizens, collecting data that no US citizen knew was being collected, harvesting information from major search engines, Google, Yahoo, Bing, and so on, without knowledge of the people using those search engines. So the fundamental right of privacy of US citizens, in this case, Indian citizens during wiretapping cases, is violated. And how can we even come to know that this right is violated? It's not a situation where we're offered this balance that has been presented in the early part of this module, that if you want security, you need to permit a little bit of secrecy, and by permitting some secrecy, you'll be giving up a bit of liberty. There's secrecy all across the board, so we're not even in a position to decide whether we find the balance falls in favor of liberty or of security. Insofar as secrecy on the part of the government can lead to the violation of basic rights, what is obviously required on the part of civil society and the citizenry is dissent and opposition. But secrecy can itself be used to silence dissent. It can also be used in more insidious ways, like profiling minorities. In the case of WikiLeaks, made famous with the situation that Julian Assange has had to go through, in the case of the Edward Snowden affair, what we found is that the only access that we have to these secrets in order to even know whether we should or should not have access to these secrets is through the process of whistleblowing. The silencing of dissent can be seen very perfectly by the fact that these whistleblowers, as soon as they release information that was classified as secret, become stateless and on the run, pursued by, in this case, the US Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, and so on. So the action of revealing certain secrets only so much to allow us to be able even to debate whether we are willing to give up those rights, in itself produces a hostile reaction which shows us very clearly that secrecy can lead as much to tyranny and the violation of rights as it can lead to security and the protection of our rights. Well, that being the case, how do we combat excessive secrecy? Democracies have designed within them their own instruments and institutions for limiting the excesses that result from secrecy. The legal and political theorist Bruce Ackerman has argued that there are three institutions of government that are designed to combat the effects of excessive secrecy. These institutions are the courts, or the judiciary, the legislative branch, and the media. Now, the media is not, of course, a part of government, but it's often referred to as the fourth estate. In the book called The Emergency Constitution by Bruce Ackerman, one of the basic ways that Ackerman suggests that we can strengthen these institutions of oversight is by forcing the legislative branch to adopt within each of its committees a member of the minority party. So you can see that if you have a majority party that enjoys power and their decisions are shrouded in secrecy, that there's a lot more motivation and possibility for taking advantage of that secrecy in terms of corruption, in terms of violating rights, and so on, than if there were members of minority and opposition also in these closed-door sessions. So Bruce Ackerman makes the case for the presence of minorities in any kind of legislative oversight committee. And in fact, he says the way that this could secrecy could be controlled most is if that minority member should in fact be appointed as the chair of any oversight committee. What that suggests is that within oversight committees in the legislative branch, when they ask for information from the executive, the minority member would be in a better position to ensure that the executive is not overreaching his power, especially in cases like prime ministerial systems, parliamentary systems like we have in India, where the executive is a member or the head of the majority party. Well, there's a problem with this position of Ackerman's, which is that there are many occasions where executive secrecy is so profound and opaque that a legislative oversight committee doesn't even know what to ask for. So what's the point of having a robust legislative oversight if they're not even sure which documents contain information that would be necessary to perform their function effectively? In this respect, Ackerman's suggestion that legislative oversight could be made more robust with the presence of minority members falls rather short of solving some of the more difficult problems of excessive secrecy. Now, the legislative committees also don't necessarily have the kind of expertise that the executive branch has, especially when it comes to national security. National security is one of the main reasons given for the need for secrecy. due to reasons of fear or due to a lack of expertise or even due to public perceptions. Legislative committees often simply defer to the executive. They say the executive branch's job is to protect us. External and internal security is the function of our military, our external intelligence, and the Home Ministry, for example, and therefore they're the experts. We are not going to tread in their territory. When that's the case, and it very often is, then the possibility of legislative oversight and combating excessive secrecy fails. Well, if that's the legislative branch, what about the judicial? Interestingly, a very similar situation often occurs with the judiciary in terms of judicial oversight. Empirical studies have shown that courts, when reviewing or conducting oversight over executive actions, have a much higher tendency to increase what's called deference to the executive. Deference refers to this admission that they are the experts, so we will have to acknowledge what they say. We are not equipped to make this determination, whereas the executive branch has thousands of intelligence operatives, it has a national security agency, it has all of the tools and technology. We are just 12 judges. So this is called deference. Judges and courts have been found in empirical studies to most often defer to the authority of the executive when it comes to questions of secrecy. So judicial oversight also fails largely in curtailing the excessive secrecy that executives operate under. Then we're left with the media. The media obviously plays a hugely important role in controlling the excesses of secrecy. It does that in various ways. It does it by constantly taking to task the executive. It does it by investigative journalism. It does it by trying to get access to documents that are marked as secret or classified as confidential. But the media is, of course, inherently limited with regard to the access to that sort of information. For access to that information, they are dependent upon insiders, they are dependent upon officials who are willing to leak documents, and they are dependent upon things that the executive tells them are the case, which they cannot verify since it's shrouded in secrecy. Not only is that a problem, the media's access to the information, but there are even cases of collusion of the media with the executive. One notorious case is, of course, the way that the New York Times cooperated with the State Department and the White House in the aim of convincing the American public to wage a war against Iraq. So the New York Times suspended its usual rigorous investigative journalism to find out whether indeed Iraq did have these so-called WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, which were used by the State Department and the President of the United States as a way of convincing the public that we must wage war against Iraq. The New York Times decided not to investigate and instead ran a number of headlines over days and weeks giving the reasons why the United States needed to go to war with Iraq. What did we find out subsequently? There were no such weapons, and in fact, they knew it all along. This is a gross failure of the media in curtailing secrecy. In fact, quite the opposite. They participate, they collude with the executive power in keeping crucial information secret and in disseminating misinformation. So this is always a risk in terms of what the media can do in combating excessive secrecy. There's always the risk of collusion with the executive. Finally, the media has one more serious limitation in serving as a check on executive secrecy, which is that there's no way to verify their sources. If they're reliant on leaked information, the usual way to corroborate information is to check it against other information. In this case, there is never any other information. To sum up then, secrecy may be required for a democracy, but it certainly conflicts with the other essential requirement, which is publicity. And so it seems that Bobbio may have been right when he suggested that this creates a serious paradox within democracies. Democracies, on the one hand, need secrecy for functioning efficiently, but on the other hand, the fact of excessive secrecy can disrupt the very enterprise of democracy itself, removing the information from citizenry that they need in order to make the very democratic decisions to perform what democracy is. Finally, secrecy can also be used to protect the wrongdoing on the part of the state. And in that regard, secrecy can be seen as something that needs a great deal of curtailment, of the ability to resist and limit by whatever institutions are available to us, whether that's judicial oversight, legislative oversight, or the media. The problem, as we have seen, is that each of these other institutions have certain shortcomings when it comes to attempting to restrict the secrecy of the executive branch, whether that be deference, whether that be corruption, whether that be collusion, or lack of access to information. So finally, in the absence of any larger accountability structures or institutions that can operate systematically to limit the ill effects of secrecy in a democracy, we are left with just one thing, and that is whistleblowers. The possibility that whistleblowers leak information and alert the public when secrecy goes wrong. Thank you very much.